Well, thanks for coming today, Dr. Melinda Cameron, a pediatrician, 35 years experience doing community pediatrics. And in that time, I'm sure that you saw a lot of kids who were poisoned by lead paint.
Yes, I was the medical director of the Regional Lead Poisoning Prevention Resource Center.
Right.
There was regional centers throughout New York State. And basically they were started in the early 1990s when state legislation went through that it was mandatory for physicians to screen kids for lead to get lead levels at H1 and H2. There are also reporting requirements. That's when it became law that labs had to report every lead level that's done to the state, and that's how we keep track of kids' lead levels.
Yep.
All that gets reported back to the counties, and then they deal with it on an individual basis, but it's all reportable to the state. So there was massive legislation that went on. And when I finished my residency in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, from pediatrics, I became in charge of our lead program at ECMC, at Erie County Medical Center, because we had a pediatric program there. And then we got some state funding to actually be a regional center. And so as a center, we assist physicians in terms of advising treatment, retesting, and actually working as a liaison between the health departments and the medical community to try to address the whole problem of lead, since the children primarily get lead from their housing.
Wow. That's a great history. So I think people know that lead's dangerous and it's more dangerous to children.
Mm-hmm.
But why is it more dangerous to children?
Lead affects pretty much every body system, but what we found over the years, there's been a ton of research done on lead. It's really the most studied environmental toxin. We've known about it for a long time. But basically it affects the nervous system, and the young nervous system as the child is developing is the most vulnerable. So adults can get lead poisoning at very high levels, but your nervous system has basically formulated by then. But the fact that lead, when children are exposed to lead, it's during the development of their brain and their nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, even at lower levels, it can affect that and cause permanent change that is irreversible.
So it's a toxic insult
Exactly.
to the developing brain.
Exactly.
And that's why a lead level in a grown person
Correct.
will have a different impact than
Right.
a lead level in a developing brain.
Exactly. Kids are more vulnerable. And the other side of that too is that developmentally kids explore their environment and they learn by putting stuff in their mouth. So that's the root of exposure. So lead can be in your environment, but if you're not ingesting it, if you're not inhaling it, then you're not exposed to it. Your body isn't harmed by it. But kids naturally suck their thumb, put their hands in their mouth. They have a lot of oral activities, and that's how they actually get it inside their bodies.
So that's why you could live in a household with children. You're not poisoned,
Exactly.
but your children are.
Right.
It's
Correct.
because adults aren't putting paint chips in their mouth.
The behaviors.
They're
Correct.
mouthing window cells,
Correct.
and we don't suck our thumbs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mostly.
mostly. It's been a persistent problem in Buffalo, lead paint poisoning.
Yes.
In the levels of kids poisoned in Buffalo, how did that rate compare to other cities?
Nationally, Buffalo has always been within like the top 10,
Right.
Probably even the top 5. And part of that is just the nature of our climate and our history and where people are living. So people are living in the older housing. A large part of it too is the paint on the exterior of the homes, our porches. We have beautiful architecture in Buffalo. We preserved a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
but that also means that the leaded paint that used to be used is there. And unless it's maintained, unless places are maintained, the leaded paint becomes exposed, and then the kids can ingest it or inhale it if there's poor work that's being done. You have to be very careful when you're doing lead remediation, when you're doing lead abatement, or you can make situations worse as well.
I call it the double whammy. You need old housing stock that's poorly maintained.
Correct.
So I live in a census tract in the city of Buffalo that has very low lead poisoning rates, even though my house is over 100 years old.
Mhm.
But I look at another census tract that on paper looks just the same.
Right.
They have a much higher poisoning rate.
Mhm.
And that mostly comes down to the maintenance
Exactly.
of the home. So
Exactly.
if the lead paint's been painted over several times as a part of routine maintenance,
Mhm.
then the chances of people being poisoned goes down. But it's really that double whammy. It's not just the old housing stock.
Exactly.
It's poorly maintained
Exactly.
old housing stock.
Yeah. Lead can be any toxic and can be in your environment, but unless you're actually ingesting it or inhaling it getting into your body, you're not necessarily affecting it. There's lots of stuff around us. There's lots of, even like viruses but they can be around us, but
Right.
unless they actually infect you, you can just kind of think of that medically, even though this is an environmental toxin.
I've done a lot of work with the city of Rochester,
Mhm.
and they have a lead poisoning rate that's significantly below ours. And they've achieved that by being very proactive on inspecting apartments where kids can live.
Mhm.
And that's the same thing that happened in New York City. They made it so mandatory inspection before
Mhm.
a child moves in. And thus the city building departments, made them fix peeling paint.
Mhm.
Made-
Rochester still has issues, though. I mean, you have to look
Well, they do.
carefully
Yeah.
because,
But I'd rather have their numbers than ours.
yeah, they still have kids with high levels, though.
Sure. So does
And
New York City.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's really, the Reuters report from a few years ago.
Yeah.
It just showed the zip codes. The 3 zip
Right.
codes in Buffalo
Yeah.
are far higher than almost anywhere else in the country. So it's really, it's so preventable. And I think that's what, drives public policy makers and I'm sure treating physicians crazy.
Exactly.
We know how to fix it.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've treated these kids with very high levels for 35 years. And if you think about these kids, what they were exposed to and what it's done to them for the rest of their lives. I mean, it in terms of their cognitive potential,
Right.
it affects behavior, impulsivity, things like ADHD are kind of linked to it. Not necessarily that it causes ADHD, but it's similar type symptoms in terms of dysregulation. And so that affects our society as a whole. So it's not just, it affects an individual child, it affects their family, but it also affects our community.
Wow. So tell me, how does being poisoned manifest itself down the road?
Exactly those types of things that I'm talking about. Less cognitive potential, more dysregulation in terms of emotional abilities. It's a lot of behavioral things which are very, very difficult, to define.
Right.
So they found these things in widespread studies. How you attribute that to an individual person is another issue in terms of looking at someone and saying, oh, they were poisoned by lead and this is the way they're acting. We really can't do that, which makes it hidden, which is part of the problem. Also, even when kids are poisoned, even when they have elevated levels as they're a child, they often don't show symptoms, even though it is harming them. So I kind of think of it as almost like a chronic disease, like high blood pressure in adults. It can be harming you very immensely and affect your future. And yet looking at that person, you wouldn't know it.
And that's why the early screening that's mandated by the state is so important.
Exactly. Age 1 and age 2. In other areas of the country, they do more targeted screening. Like if you don't have the housing issue, if you don't have a large amount of your population, of your pediatric population exposed, then you can target those kids who are most at risk. But in our area, we basically say, test all the kids. Age 1, age 2, and also when they come in there for their well child visits, to know if they have excessive hand-to-mouth activity or to ask about the housing or the babysitter's housing, or if the parents have seen them with a lot of hand-to-mouth activity. Also kids with developmental disabilities, because those children tend to have more hand-to-mouth activity as well.
Right. And then, we also changed the rules. One more safeguard is